One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs, and you're listening to the Sales Hacker Podcast. Today, we've got Jamie Scarborough on the pod. Jamie is one of the co-founders and partners, and maybe president. He's got a number of important titles at Sales Talent Agency, STA, which is one of the largest recruiting firms specifically for salespeople in Canada. And he's on the pod to talk about they interacted with 18,000 different sales professionals in 2018 alone, and they placed over 800 folks. So Jamie understands what you need to do when you go into an interview, what you need to do when you're thinking about your career. He also understands if you're a hiring manager, if you are a sales manager looking to build your team, some things that you need to think about. And also, the most, or perhaps one of the most interesting parts of it is Toronto is booming right now. The Revenue Collective, the organization that I run, we have 6 chapters all over the world, and one of those 6 is Toronto, and it's because it's growing so quickly. And specifically for sales teams, and really for great companies. They just build great B2B tech in Toronto and in Canada. That's been at least my experience. Home of Shopify and a bunch of other amazing companies. Now, of course, we want to thank our sponsors before we deeply dive in. So the first is Chorus.ai. Chorus is the leading conversation intelligence platform for high-growth sales teams. It records, transcribes, and analyzes business conversations in real time to coach reps on how to become top performers. With Chorus, more reps meet quota, new hires ramp faster, leaders become better coaches, everyone in the organization can collaborate over the actual voice of the customer. I've used Chorus. It's a fantastic product. One of the great features of Chorus is a playlist. So you can put together a playlist of best moments on the sales team or, coaching moments. But it's a really, really powerful platform. The entire category is really special. So that's chorus.ai/sales hacker to see what they're up to. We also are always sponsored by Outreach, and Outreach is the leading sales engagement platform. That's Outreach.io. Outreach supports sales reps by enabling them to humanize their communications at scale. So I suppose that means dropping authentic pieces of information into email communication as opposed to always looking like a bot. Now, they automate the bad part of the job. That's the soul-sucking manual work. And what they do is provide action-oriented tips on what communications are working best. So Outreach has your back. And this is particularly important because if you're sending generic emails right now, they are not working. Cold call pickup rates are declining. It's getting more and more difficult to get through to people if you're not personalizing the experience, and that's what Outreach helps you do. Now, we've got 2 more announcements. March, Outreach is running Unleash 2019. That's the conference. It's going to be the definitive Great New Sales Engagement Conference, and it's going to take place March 10th through 12th in San Diego. Listeners of the pod get $100 off simply for entering the code SHPOD. So hop over to Outreach. The website is unleash.outreach.io and use the code SHPOD to save $100 off your ticket. And then lastly, we started a new tradition at Sales Hacker. It's our top 50 awards. So we're continuing it this year. Look for those amazing salespeople. We're looking for those amazing salespeople who elevated the sales profession in 2018. So we ask you, podcast listeners, to nominate your colleagues or yourselves. It's okay if you nominate yourself. We may know, but we won't judge you. It's a judgment-free zone, and you're salespeople. We're all salespeople, so we got to nominate ourselves. Winners will be featured on this very podcast. We're going to interview the winners. And we'll receive some other very exciting prizes, including the recognition and praise of the Sales Hacker community. So get nominating. You can nominate at saleshacker.com/nominate. saleshacker.com/nominate. Now, without further ado, let us listen to Jamie Scarborough on the Sales Hacker Podcast. Hey, everybody. It is Sam Jacobs. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We are really, really excited to have a different type of guest. Today, we've got Jamie Scarborough on the pod. And Jamie is important for a number of different reasons that I think we're going to find out. But let me give you his quick background. Jamie's a founding partner at Sales Talent Agency, one of North America's biggest and most prolific sales recruitment companies. And they've placed more than 800 sales professionals in 2018 alone. So as co-president, Jamie has helped more than 1,000 employers from Salesforce, Shopify, and TELUS to Auckland's Grainger, SAP, and Castrol attract and hire top revenue generators. The company's been recognized by Canadian Business through its annual Growth 500 listings for 5 years in a row. And STA founded and runs the Great Canadian Sales Competition, which has introduced more than 11,000 college and university students to B2B sales since launching in 2014. He's also a featured expert for Profit Guide in the areas of sales leadership and recruitment strategy. So if you did not quite pick up, Jamie runs one of the largest and most successful recruiting agencies specifically for salespeople in Canada. They're based in Toronto. And if you don't know about Toronto, the Revenue Collective is launching a chapter there for very good reason. It's boomtown right now. Toronto is one of the fastest growing markets specifically for sales and marketing in North America. And I think learning about both the growth of that market, but also Jamie and his team work with, as he mentioned, they placed over 800 sales professionals in 2018. So thinking about that, they must have interacted with thousands and thousands of sales professionals. They know benchmarking data. They know what's going on in the market. I think it's going to be a great conversation. So Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. Nice to chat to you. We actually interacted with 18,000.
So I knew you would have that number. You guys have all of the data, is what I'm learning about you.
We follow Salesforce like every other sales company. We've got our KPIs and our dashboards. And obviously, one of the biggest things we follow is how many salespeople we meet and how many we interact with and how many we think are really good and how many we can place and how many we do place.
So, while we're here, tell me some of those stats. So what is I'm specifically interested in sort of like the ratio between what you just said, people that are really good versus how many people you meet. What is that percentage?
Probably 15% of the people we meet, we could realistically place. Now, that doesn't mean 15% can get a job. Obviously, the standards for a recruitment agency who has to charge a client for that introduction is much higher than if that introduction came from an employee referral or came by applying through an Indeed job posting. They're not going to look at the candidate the same way. But 15% of the people that we meet, we could typically place. Now, some of it is just timing. We don't have the right role for that person at the right time. We have amazing candidates sometimes who fit all of our requirements, but by the time we've got something for them, it's too late. They've already got something else or they've been promoted or something. But 15% of who we meet, we've got a realistic chance of presenting and placing.
I think that's an amazing stat because at least in the US, the unemployment rate's below 4%, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that 85% of the candidates that you meet, you don't think you can find a role for, even if some of them are just timing based.
Yeah, so absolutely. There's maybe, again, the standard for our business is really high. Most of the candidates that we can place have a job already. It's very hard for us to place someone who doesn't have a job. Unfortunately, this is something we're trying to address. If someone's at a certain career point, they're a little less attractive for a company to pay us for. Clients can be a little myopic in terms of what they're looking for, in terms of cultural fit. As they call it for their business, and we're going to try and change that perception. We think that's an opportunity. But yeah, and some people are just not good enough. If they've had too many jumps on their careers, sales is incredibly measurable. If they haven't hit the targets they need to hit consistently, they may feel they're really good, and they can sometimes get very upset with us for not presenting them to roles that they think they would be brilliant at. But the reality is we're in a world where our client dictates a very, very high bar, and we have to jump over it.
That makes a lot of sense. We're going to dive into a lot of the conversation, both especially around all of the data that you've seen. And, I have so many different questions about personality profiles and the advice that you give your clients. But let's focus on you for a second. We can hear the accent. So tell us where you're from.
I sound Australian. I'm from East London. So if you think of a 20-minute train ride from Liverpool Street Station.
I can assure you that most of the people listening have no idea where Liverpool Street Station is, but I actually do know where it is.
Well, maybe we're underselling. A lot of people have seen that food map. No, I grew up in England, but I actually got to Canada when I was 19 in 1994. And I've been here ever since. I live half in Vancouver, half in Toronto. So almost like if for people that don't know the map, that's kind of like living half in LA, half in New York. I got it when I was 19. I had been doing, had no education, no university degree. 70% of Canadians have some kind of post-secondary education. So it was typically would be a disadvantage. But I came into Canada at an amazing time. I debate this with my mum a lot about the best time to grow up in terms of the ability to get a job. And I believe that I had an incredible lucky advantage because at the age of 19, 20, the World Wide Web is basically just launching. And so no one is really trained on it except for the engineers. So no one in sales, they're not looking for education. They're looking for bright minds. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get a head start.
Wow. And what prompted you to move from London to Toronto and Vancouver to move to Canada in the first place?
Well, growing up in England, I would watch all of these great shows like Baywatch and Neighbours and 90210, and I'm sitting in this East London house in a miserable grey area. And listen, England's wonderful. I go back there all the time. My family's still there, and I love it. But at that point, I didn't. I was like, what am I doing? There's beaches around the world. There's places you can go, and there's people having showers, and we have bathtubs, and there's all of these kind of advantages that I'm just thinking, what am I doing? And so from a very, very young age, all I wanted to do was get out. I left England very young, actually, around 16. And
so that gap between 16 and 19, you were traveling the world and seeing the world, or did something else happen?
That makes it sound much more romantic than it was. I was, a lot of people go and want to see amazing things. I just wanted literally to go and run all over the place and be chaotic. And that's what I did. I lived in Tenerife was the first place I went to. I went there on a small vacation with a friend and just tore up my ticket and didn't come back for the summer. That was the first thing. And then I went from there to Barbados and did the same thing and longer. And then I went from there to Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia. That's where I get this crazy accent. And
you may have also gotten the traveling bug from Australia, because this is a very traditional profile for a lot of the Aussies I know.
And Vancouver's a very traditional place for them to come to. So
when you got to Canada, how did you, that's 1994. STA is obviously not, whatever it is, 20 plus years old.
Years away. Yeah.
So walk us through that path, and specifically the path to, starting your own business, and what you were doing before and what the impetus was to become an entrepreneur.
I got a sales job. So obviously when you're traveling like that, and even before that, I always wanted freedom. And my whole life, that's kind of been my driving force. And so I wanted money early. I wanted to have enough money where I didn't have to rely on anybody else. And so I would take jobs. I would work in bars very, very early. I'm very tall. And I could, in England, there was a little bit more leniency. So from 14, I was working in pubs. I was doing paper routes. I was selling steak knives door to door. I was working on a market stall selling rugs and carpets. Anything I could do to make money, I was happy to do, just to create a bankroll so that I had some freedom. And I get to Canada at 19 after doing all of that for years and years without really any idea of what I'm going to do. I did not have a corporate bone in my body. My older sister was very, at that point, and still, but at that point I felt very accomplished in the corporate world. It didn't feel like me. And I thought I was going to be a writer. So I started writing a book. I finished the book. It was terrible. It was called The Boy I Knew. It was a horrible book. I still have it somewhere. It makes me cringe whenever I pick it up.
Was it fiction? Was it fiction or nonfiction? What was the book about?
It was very salacious and fictional. It was fantastic and terrible. And I sent the first couple of chapters to a bunch of advertising agencies and publishing companies to try and be an editor, really. I didn't think I was going to get the book sold. I really didn't think it was that good at that time. So I tried to be an editor or a writer, and I got a job as a junior copywriter with a recruitment advertising agency called TMP. It was actually called Callow at the time. But
very familiar with TMP. I used to work at them.
Oh, there you go. So at the time, recruitment advertising was massive. You've got to think, this is before the internet. So companies were spending an absolute fortune to advertise jobs, to advertise their company as a place to work. And so it was a huge business. If you wanted to advertise a engineering job, you'd spend, $30,000-$40,000 on a weekly newspaper ad in the Toronto Globe and Mail. And my job was to write those awful ads that were "Here we grow again" and all of those kind of things. And I did that for years and got promoted a few times. And they had trouble fitting me into where they thought I could be. I loved working with clients and loved working with a team and really enjoyed what we were doing. And so a few years in, they said, well, would you like to be a salesperson? And at this point, I progressed to being a creative director. I was probably 24, 25. And I said, no, I love that title, creative director. That's fantastic. And they said, well, you're going to make a lot more money. And I said, well, okay, let's give it a try. And so I gave it a try, got into sales, and absolutely loved it. And TMP ended up owning something called monster.com, which was a huge job board, the late 1990s and early 2000s.
Heard of it?
And it was massive. And I ended up working there as a salesperson. I was sales rep of the year for the multiple years. I managed their team and met my business partner now, who became sales rep of the year after when I was in that leadership role. And then we decided we were going to start a company. And we thought, hey, you know what we should do? I don't like the job board business because you don't feel like you're solving a problem. You feel too far away from hires. And we didn't feel that there was a really good sales recruitment specific company. And we just went, we're going to go and do it. And so we started 2007 Sales Talent Agency.
So you've been in business for 12 years. So how's it going, and sort of what have you learned? And tell us about, I mean, I kind of know how it's going because I was in your offices last week and it's going amazing, but tell the rest of the audience, about the growth over the last 12 years and sort of how the business is doing.
Well, it's funny because we're on this fastest growing list, which always makes me laugh because we're the slowest growing, fast growing company I've ever seen. We're a really good company. We've got 60 people, all amazing, problem solvers, all different career levels. That's what they do every single day. 60% of our income goes out to salaries and bonuses and commissions because our product really is people. The people that solve the problems for our clients. Every year we've grown. Every single quarter we've grown year over year. We're now at 10 million, just a little over 10 million of revenues a year. Any company in the software space that got to 10 million after 11 years would want to jump off a bridge. But we're really happy with it. We love what we do. We work with some amazing companies. We try and be better all the time. I think what's really excited me about our company is, you start the business and you go, hey, we're going to be the greatest sales recruitment company ever. And we placed candidates and we were actually doing pretty well. And a few years in, we realized, actually, the candidates we're placing are not that much better than the candidates that they're hiring themselves. The only difference is they're paying a lot more money for them. And so we really looked at our business and said, we've got to figure out what the ingredients for a great salesperson is. And we came up with something called DNA Pro, which is super simple and almost to the point of idiocy. But it is amazing and it is incredibly impactful. And every time I talk to a sales leader about it, they are like, oh my God, how do we not been doing this all along?
Well, what is it? Tell us about it.
Well, so, there's loads of ways to analyze salespeople, right? There's loads of opportunities you can have. The more time you can spend with a candidate, the better. Every employer is trying to make great sales hires. And so we said, okay, well, what are we trying to analyze though? What are we actually looking for? And so we asked all of our clients, what do you look for in a salesperson? And we were finding within the same company, if you put a whiteboard up and said, what do you look for in a salesperson? Every sales leader would come up with 50 different things. And we were like, well, why are we all looking for the same ingredients, but said a different way? And we came up with DNA Pro. DNA is related to their raw talent. So if someone's 17 years of age or if they're 70 years of age, what is the ingredients that you need to be really good at sales? And then PRO, hey, what makes you job ready for this role right now? How can you ramp up quickly? So it's simple for us was DNA was drive, nature, acumen. Very simple words, but we broke them down in a way that a lot of people hadn't thought of them before. So for example, drive. Everyone would say, yes, a salesperson needs drive, but we often as leaders miscategorize drive with ambition. We think that somebody's ambitious, therefore they're driven. We think that they're loud and aggressive, therefore they're driven. But what we found was you needed three things to have drive in the way that we needed it. We needed someone who had a great work ethic. Hey, salespeople have a lot of place to hide. Not so much in the modern era, but at the time we launched, there was a lot of outside salespeople who could sit in their car for hours on end if they wanted to. So we needed someone who was, had a great work ethic. They were accountable to themselves. We needed someone who set goals for themselves. As you know, companies set goals for salespeople all the time, but the best salespeople pretty much ignore those goals. They don't care about quota. Quota's for mediocre people. They care about the goals they set for themselves, which are typically much higher than quota. And we want someone who's resilient enough to go through all of the crap you have to go through to get to those goals. As a salesperson, you're going to get told no a ton, and you got to be okay with that. Not accept it, but be okay with it. So having a good work ethic with the resiliency to be able to get to that goal was a huge thing. And so we're always looking for people that have set goals for themselves depending on what career level they are. It may be in their personal, professional, educational, athletic life. And we want to see how hard that goal was and what they did specifically to bust through that wall, to punch through that wall to get to that goal. So that was drive. Okay, well, that was fantastic. Then we said, well, drive's not enough because, hey, a serial killer can have drive. We need someone who's got a great amount of nature. What we refer to as nature is emotional intelligence. You can call it empathy if you want to. We debate often whether there is empathy. But emotional intelligence is critical for a salesperson. You're going to be dealing with people all the time, different kinds of people, different personality types, different career levels, different influence levels. And you need to be able to understand where they're coming from. You need to be able to have a conversation with them in a way that makes sense to them. And then finally, you need acumen. We're in a world where we want challengers. We want solution salespeople. We want consultants. We're problem solvers as salespeople now. And so we need someone who's bright and curious. They don't have to be a Jeopardy champion. They just have to have a bright, curious mind where they're going to become an expert at something. If you think about the best challengers, they're experts. They're not challenging just because they're dicks. They're actually challenging because they know what they're talking about. And the client may have a problem that they don't even recognize yet. And that salesperson is going to help them figure that out because they know it. They learn more about the sales process. They learn more about the competition. They learn more about the sales, the client and what they do and how they do it and what challenges they face. And they are sponges for information. So that's just the DNA side. And you can kind of see that if you start digging into that, you can get really passionate about not just what it is, but how to find that in someone.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the question. The main, and so first of all, one comment is to your point, exactly to your point, like a lot of these qualities are just, a lot of people are talking about them, but using slightly different words. I have a question, about drive and about resiliency. Do you have a degree of difficulty scale when you're asking a question of a candidate? You say, what's the hardest thing you've ever done? And you sort of have a framework where if it wasn't quite hard enough in your opinion, then that disqualifies them. How do you test for drive?
Well, so every role, so if you think of DNA as dimmer switches, right? So some roles require a lot more drive than other roles. If you're selling steak knives door to door, you're going to need a drive on 11. Whereas if you're working for a company as an account manager, your drive level may not need to be quite as high. It doesn't mean it can be a 2, but it doesn't have to be quite as high. So a lot of the time we're analyzing based on a specific role, what the requirements are, as opposed to whether they could be good at all. But when we're looking at drive, the question we always ask ourselves is, why is that good? For example, if you get someone junior in our company, the first few weeks of their job is literally just to analyze DNA of hundreds of candidates. That's what their only job is, to interview, analyze, so that we can kind of help them direct their questions. Because it's not a same question every single time. You've got to try and dig in and figure out what was hard for them. And it doesn't mean just because they have drive that they'll be good in sales. For example, there's loads of people that have an amazing will when it comes to exercise. Maybe it's to a triathlete, but they haven't prioritized work in the same way. They've prioritized their health, their fitness in that way. So their drive is being executed completely. Their goals are completely related to their athletic achievement. What we've got to do is not only find out, do they have drive, but is it directed in a way that is useful for us and our clients?
And would you say that directing it usefully means, frankly, I mean, this is something I've always learned when I was going through discussions about assessment and assessing personality profile, is they like to make money and they're willing to admit that. Is that a framework or a test that you use when you're talking to candidates?
I think that's a really great question. I just said about myself, I want to make money. The question is why and how much, right? Because what you're trying to do, so let's say, for example, if it's someone at the beginning of their career, I want to make money. I want to know, what does that mean to you? And what are you prepared to do to get it? Does making money mean $40,000 a year, consistent income, or does it mean you want to get to $100,000 in the next 2 years? In which case, that's kind of interesting. Now, that's just ambition again. I've now got to align that with the analysis of whether they have what it takes to meet that ambition, the work ethic and the resiliency. But that's the goal they've got. It's an interesting goal. That does help me align it and say, yeah, you've got the right goal. Now, if someone's a bit more senior, their goal related to money can become completely different, almost debilitating. where they become golden handcuffs. And they're more focused on a consistent big income than they are about chasing something much bigger.
It's a great point.
It's fascinating, Sam, because even this conversation, you can see it's so fluid. If I knew exactly how to identify driving every single person 100% of the time, I would be I'd be rich in an amazing way. Now, what is interesting for me is that what I say to employers all the time, and they have to keep in mind that as an employer, your job is to take risks, but it's to analyze and mitigate bad risk. Right? Hiring someone is like betting in poker. You can't win unless you bet, but you can only lose if you bet. And same as in recruitment and employment. You can't get bigger, you can't get more money unless you hire people, but the only way you can make bad hires is by hiring people. So your job now is not to be right, it's to mitigate as much risk as possible. There is no successful leader out there that hasn't made mistakes, including me. Lots and lots of them. I did analysis last year. We'd hired 128 people in our entire history, and I tried to put them in 3 buckets as to should I never have hired them? Should I have hired them and they did a great job and that was awesome? Or could I have done a better job as a company? But every employer, every leader needs to be analyzing that and trying to get closer and closer and closer to the root of risk mitigation and risk assessment.
Yeah. And so, I agree completely that I've always said hiring is a probabilistic exercise. That's how you have to understand it.
I love that.
And to your point, if you're not hiring at all, and also it shouldn't keep. I guess. Well, I'd love your reaction to this statement, which is the lack of a perfect hiring process should not keep you from making hires. What do you think about that?
Well, of course, absolutely. First, yes. So what is a perfect hiring process? There's amazing books out there. Let's look at something like top grading, which is a really interesting way of analyzing of interviewing. A lot of companies have used that very successfully in the past, but it is flawed as well. Everything is flawed. The reality of recruitment is you could yell out of your window, who wants a job? Someone could lift up their hand, and that could theoretically be your best hire you've ever made. It could theoretically. Now, the probability is low, so the better you can get at recruiting, that's awesome. But we do notice that as companies go from early stages where the leader of the company who's got a real good pulse on what they want, the leader of the company who's got that pulse on what they want, as they get further and further away from the recruiting process, the company that can often go through some challenges because the people they've put in a much more stringent recruitment process, but the people in that process aren't as close to the solution.
That's really interesting.
And it takes a while to get past that. And then you get to companies that are really big who, frankly, are just doing a horrible job because they've let their operations HR team take control of it in a way that is impossible for you to make good decisions as a leader. You're making decisions that are holistic, that are designed to weed out the worst, not to get the best.
I want to ask you a question about sort of career pathing for people. The world has changed so much. What advice, when you've got all of these young, sales professionals, and you met 18,000 last year, what's the advice that you're giving them specifically about managing their career? Do you think, have the rules changed? Have they evolved? Are they still the same? And what do you see, the common mistakes people make as they look out, 5 to 10 years over the course of their career?
Well, we run, as you said earlier, we run the biggest student competition in the country, which is designed to get young people into sales in the first place. This year, in year 5, we've got 4,000 people from 80 campuses across the country who are all talking about sales. That doesn't mean they're going to go into sales, but they're talking about it in a way that they wouldn't have done 6 years ago. And so we talk to them a lot about career path and ideas and how do you manage a career? And again, it depends on your level, but let's talk about someone early stages. The first thing you've got to say is, well, what do you need? What is your hierarchy of needs? Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Of course.
We talk about a hierarchy of needs a lot, which is what is the first thing you need as a salesperson? And what they often forget is the value proposition. You can get so attracted to these bright and shiny companies that are getting a lot of money invested in them, but they actually, as a salesperson, are incredibly hard to sell because they don't have something that really is unique and compelling. They don't have proof of it. And so the first thing a salesperson you've got to look for when you're making a decision on a role is, do you have something that has an audience? And can you communicate that factor to that audience in a way that is compelling? And then you go, well, is there a manager, a leader, a coach, or an infrastructure that's set up for me to continue to develop? Obviously, if you're a little later in your career, you may want more autonomy and no development. You're a gun for hire. But early on, you don't know anything. I think about myself as a salesperson in my early days in B2B sales, and I was absolutely useless. I still made sales, but at a rate that was so much less efficient and effective than it would be at this stage of my career. And so for me, first of all, it's the biggest mistake people make is they jump to a shiny object. They're in a path. Instead of staying in that path, someone else comes along, a company like mine, and they wave, hey, look at this. You've been there for 8 months, 9 months, a year. Look what you could be doing. Look how much they'll pay you. And you make that move. And as much as you would think as a recruitment agency, we would encourage that. We don't at all. We feel like every career jump should be a 3-year minimum career jump so that you've had a chance to learn something, prove something, and get a really good reference and advocate from your employer.
And so that's interesting. I mean, I would bet that most, sales professionals, particularly early in their career, are not staying places for 3 years. I would imagine that from your perspective, it doesn't hurt them quite as much as it maybe used to 20 or 30 years ago. But, it strikes me just that the act of putting the stones together, the path, assembling the path that becomes a career is just much less transparent to people in terms of what should they do than it's ever been before, I guess. I mean, I don't know if you agree.
Well, I think that the average tenure of a salesperson, we know the average tenure of a salesperson is much, much less than that. I mean, we're in a really hyper fast, as you said earlier, Toronto is a growing market. If you look at Boston, if you look at Seattle, if you look at Houston, San Francisco, New York, similar markets. Where there is a huge amount of new companies that are coming up that are being incredibly well funded, that are looking for really good talent, and that talent pool is scarce. And so it is really attractive to make those moves. When I say 3 years, that is an ideal. That certainly is not what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. When you, so we've talked sort of from the candidate perspective, when you're coaching employers, you mentioned TMP, and, I think employer branding is more important than ever. Mm-hmm. Certainly I worked at the Muse, so that would reinforce that idea. But, what are you coaching the employers, the companies, when they're trying to put together? You mentioned that there's a bunch of flaws in the recruiting process. What do you think is the perfect recruiting process, and how should a company design itself in order to get the best possible talent?
So we have an answer for this. I'm going to just go through our thought process on it.
I love it. Answers are good.
Perfect. So the first thing I want an employer to think about is, what is a good hire, right? Because oftentimes when you say, hey, what's a great hire you've made? They'll tell you someone in the last 6-7 months who they love, who's doing a good job. But actually, if you think about a great hire, it's someone who's hit numbers, been a cultural contributor to help you grow as a business for an extended period of time. Whatever that period of time is depends on your business. On how quickly you can monetize them, how quickly they can ramp up. If it's a sales cycle of 18 months or more, if they're not there for 3 years, there's no chance they've been effective. And if it's a really fast sales cycle, they could have been really effective in 18 months. But the first thing you've got to do is say, well, what is a great hire? And now you've got to say, well, why do we not sometimes make great hires? What is the most obvious reason? And the first thing that an employer will say to you is, well, we chose incorrectly. I should have chose a different person. And what we will typically say is, yeah, that's one of them, but there's 2 other reasons that are much bigger. Those reasons are that you didn't have good people to choose from. You didn't find and attract them. So you ended up choosing high risk hires that you shouldn't have chosen because you hadn't got low risk hires in your pipeline. And the other one is that you had a good hire, you didn't equip them for success. You're blaming all of their failure on them, when actually you need to take a much bigger look at yourself. So we come up with something called FACE, F-A-C-E, find, attract, choose, equip. And every one of our biggest clients, we try and do it with every client, but we're much more transactional with some. We look at that find, attract, choose, equip, and we try and analyze each of those areas and say, okay, how are you finding candidates? How are you basically getting in front of people that would have a conversation with you? They've got the skill set basically you're looking for, and they want to have a conversation with you. What are you doing in terms of employer referrals? What are you doing in terms of inbound leads? What are you doing in terms of outbound networking or headhunting or whatever you call it? Then you say, well, now that you're having these conversations, that's great, but good candidates have choice. How can you attract those good candidates to your business? You need to know what those good candidates want, and you need to be understanding that a ping pong table is not going to do it. I go into so many companies now, and this is kind of a cliche, but we'll go into that company, and the first thing they show us when they talk about their employee experience is a games room or is a kitchen that's got free food. And it's like, well, listen, that may appeal to some people, but it doesn't appeal to good salespeople. They can pay for their own stuff.
Damn straight. I'm against free food.
Absolutely. And then we go to find, attract. Now you got to choose them. Use that DNA Pro process. That doesn't mean that solves your problem. It's just the ingredients. But now let's look at how you're going to identify those ingredients. And I'll get to that pro part later if you want to. And then the last part is equip. Okay, you've done all this work. You've lifted up all the rocks to find them. You've worked really hard to build an environment that attracts them. You've looked at your compensation. You've done everything. You've gone and you've analyzed them based on DNA Pro to choose them. You've done all kinds of panel interviewing, top grading, assignments, assessments. And now you've got to equip them for success. You've got to put them in a spot where that Maslow's hierarchy of sales needs is actually provided. You've got to keep looking at it over and over again and say, what do they need that they don't have right now to be the best version of themselves, so that they're not only performing at a high rate, but they're also happy here. Most people don't want to jump from job to job. They do it because they're running out of a perceived roadway where they are.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, I feel like even just what kind of advice do you give companies around employer branding? Are you telling them hire TMP, do big videos? What's sort of the fundamentals from that perspective, just when we're thinking about attract?
Yeah, we talk about being authentic. Again, I try and be agnostic in terms of referrals, like who do you refer someone to? I find TMP I worked for years. It depends what team you get, like any advertising agency. If the team that some advertising companies of any kind come in with is their best team, and then once you're there for a year, do you still have their best team? But theoretically, you need to, however you do it, whether it be outsourcing it or internally, you need to say, what is our experience? We talk about it as an employer brand. We talk about it as a culture. What is our experience, and how can we communicate that so that the people that would really enjoy this experience know of it, can interact with it? We try and get them to be much, much more authentic. I'll give you an example. Right now, one of the things that every candidate does, ideally, they should, before they make a decision, is they go onto Glassdoor and they look at all of the Glassdoor reviews of that company. Well, who puts a review? What employee puts a review on Glassdoor? There are
mostly the disgruntled negative employee. That's been my experience.
That's the first one. Who's the other one?
The manager posing as a mid-level employee.
The HR person, the manager, the manager's family, who's going, this is the greatest place I've ever worked at. I would never work anywhere else again. If someone gave me $100,000 more, I would. There's no way. Yes, there's two things. So we've got this Glassdoor, which theoretically is an interesting idea, but in practice is actually a very flawed analysis. So you go, oh, well, why? You need to not let them be so reliant on that analysis. Give your candidates more transparency into what you do really well and what you don't do really well. Do exit interviews on camera with people that leave the organization and let their words stand. Don't let it be phony. Have an opportunity to really tell your story. What do you do well? What don't you do well? What are you improving? How do your managers lead? What is their goal? How are they measured? When are promotions made? How are they made? Is it a meritocracy? If so, how can you prove it? It's exactly the same. We put so much effort now into what we sell as a company. But the reality is, without the right sales professionals, we are in a really tough spot. We need to put as much thought into how to communicate our value proposition to the employees before they get there. And it's not as easy as a nice ad from TMP.
You're damn right.
TMP can definitely help. Don't get me wrong. Hey, listen, I did great work there and I know some amazing people. But if you're expecting advertising to solve your problem, you'll get people coming in who leave 3, 6, 9 months later because it wasn't true. You got to get to the root of what you do really well, figure out what you do poorly, and look for ways to mitigate those challenges. If you know you can't pay as much as the market, you got to be a little bit more thoughtful about the candidate pool that you go from and not try and get people from the same pool. Be a little smarter. You have to look at all of the little things that you do really well. And, we're in a world where there are some beast companies out there that have a lot more money to spend. So if you're thinking that the only way you're going to get candidates is by outspending, you don't have a lot of bullets in your gun.
You're absolutely right. And also you just have to decide where do you want to emphasize, and maybe pay is one of the areas that you want to emphasize. But then again, you're going into the deep water with the people with pools of capital like Facebook and Salesforce and all those folks.
I just got to be realistic, because a lot of the employers will say, "Yeah, but Tim makes that money, and he's fine." And you go, "Well, hey, Tim hasn't been recruited enough yet. Tim's an anomaly." If you can survive building your business on Tim, good for you. But you may need 60 of those, 100 of those, 200 of those, and you're in a tough spot.
You're absolutely right. So we're almost at the end, actually, of our time together. But there's one last topic I want to talk about, because we love giving sort of practical, actionable, market-driven insights. So you're in the market all the time, talking to SDRs and account executives. You're in Toronto. Walk us through some of the numbers. What are the numbers that you're seeing for base salary? Are we still seeing, account executive, at least mid-market SaaS account executives in New York, market's about 60-60. So $60,000 base, $60,000 bonus. The quote is probably 5X the OTE on the commission target. SDRs are different. What are you saying, Jamie, in terms of compensation, so that the people listening can know if they're, making the amount that they're supposed to, if they're overpaid, underpaid, and what the frameworks are?
I think it's a really timely question. Obviously, the first question we ever get asked by an employer is, what should we pay? That is a question that we've tried to answer over the years with a salary guides. We've got a definitive salary guide, but actually that guide is just vastly out of date now. And what we've found is that every salary guide is out of date. How we're taking that information is incredibly flawed. And so we're actually in the process of building something right now called our Last 100. And our Last 100 is essentially an algorithm, and it takes our last 100 placements, whether it be holistically or in specific regions or with specific job titles or role descriptions. And you can actually see the last 100 placements, what the salary was, what the total income was, what a word cloud of what benefits were. And you can also see that down to the last 10 placements. So you can start to get a real time. It will update all the time, because every placement we make will be added to that data. So the last 100 is always changing and the last 10 is always changing.
How do we get our hands on the last 100? Sounds amazing.
We're going to be launching it in the next, before the end of Q1. We will have launched it, and I would love for you to help us analyze it, Sam. Obviously, this is something that's passionate for you, and I would love your help with that.
Great.
I will definitely get you on that team. But so theoretically, we've got something that we've got to finish, but is a really good answer for this. Let's look at it practically. As you know, in major markets around North America, real estate has jumped massively in the last few years, in the last 10, 15 years. Compensation has not typically matched that. And it was pushing at the seams in the last few years, and it has exploded now. The last 2 years have had massive, massive increases in the income and the salaries and the market expectations of candidates and what they're getting out there. For example, if you're a new graduate now, just 2 or 3 years ago, you could have come out in a sales role for a $36,000 salary, a $45,000. You're not going to get anywhere close to that anymore. If a new graduate's not coming into a role unless it's $42,000 to $60,000. A
new graduate for an SDR.
New graduate for an SDR.
Now, remember these Canadian dollars or US dollars?
Canadian dollars, Sam. So whenever I'm talking about this money right now, we do a lot of placements in the US, but I don't have quite as much of a knowledge of that. So I'm going to use Canadian dollars. You've got to take 30% difference on that.
All good. So let's say 42 to 60 is what you mentioned. So let's say $50,000 is the midpoint, and that's base.
That's a base salary, and typically it will be for an SDR BDR. The base salary is going to be higher, and you're going to have another 20-30% in commissions or bonuses. Once you get to that AE range, you're going to get in more like 50-50%, 50%.
Yeah.
And now in the AE range, there's a really, really wide range. Again, it depends on the industry, but let's stay within the tech space for the time being. You're definitely now looking at a very minimum of a 65K base. And we've seen AEs in the last year going for over 180.
180 base.
And again, it depends on what their expectation is, the expectation of what they're going to be bringing into a company. If they're working on software deals that are millions and millions of dollars and they're expected to do 3 huge deals a year, 180 base with a 360 on target is absolutely in the realm of possibility. Whereas if you're looking at something that the sales cycle is more likely 6 months, the average deal size, the annual revenues, the annual revenues of a company, or the price point would be $20,000. You're probably looking closer from 65 to 85K base with an on-target income of 130 to 170.
Yeah. Great. Last question specifically on SDRs. Okay, if you don't know the answer, but we talk a lot about SDR comp plans. Do you see commonalities there? The 20 to 30%, is it typically just opportunities generated or meetings set? Do you see a significant percentage of the time that the SDR is getting, 1% of the closed business that they originate? Just talk to us a little bit about that, because it's a topic of common discussion.
We all know that the sales process in software, since predictable revenue came out in 2011, the sales process has changed dramatically for almost every company, but especially in the software space. Everyone's taking chunks of the sales process. Very few people are doing full sales cycle. When it's full sales cycle, you can be measured completely on revenue, and it's fine. You're opening the revenue, you're closing the revenue. When it comes to an SDR or BDR, but let's talk about let's talk about an outbound sales professional who's only responsible for essentially getting it to the point where qualifying to the point where an AE is taking it over. To give them it based on revenues, actual deal closing, can be quite frustrating for them, because they have so little control over that actual deal closing. And it's also so much later than when they were involved in the process. They could be involved in the process 8 months before anything happens. So what we're finding more and more is people being paid for activity and quality activity as opposed to revenues. Being paid for the booked meeting as opposed to being paid. They may get a trailing number based on the revenues, but it won't be just revenues. It will be based on quality activities, meetings booked, meetings that convert into quality sales processes, as opposed to just the revenue that's generated from it.
Got it. Very good. Jamie, it's been incredible to have you on the show. We did not get, unfortunately, to figuring out what pro is. Why don't you tell us very quickly what? Yeah, exactly. That is that. And we're going to have you on Friday Fundamentals in a couple of days, and that's when I'm going to ask you one question, which is, what's the number one piece of advice you can give people going into an interview? But before we part ways this time, it would be great. So if I'm a person in Toronto, or I'm considering moving to Canada, or I'm just a sales professional, I want to get in touch with you. I guess the first question is, is that okay? Are you open to people that are listening to the podcast reaching out to you?
Absolutely. I'm not just okay, I'm encouraged. If you ever want to reach out to me, you can obviously reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction.
Very good. Very good. And any parting words or life motto or guiding principles that you want to share before we hit the road on this conversation?
We have a very cliched motto at Sales Talent Agency, which is the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And so we try and explode. We try and take everything we do seriously, even when it should be laughed at. We try and take every day as if it is something that's really important. Every client problem, we understand that we're not curing cancer. Most companies aren't. So there is a certain sense of humor you have to have in business. But we take every problem that we get really, really seriously, and try and run it as hard as we possibly can, and be the salespeople, be the business people that we want our clients to hire.
I love it. I love it. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us on the Sales Hacker podcast, folks. It's the spelling, the last name is Scarborough, Scarborough. And he's on LinkedIn. So if you want to reach out to him on LinkedIn and get in touch, he'll be responsive. And if you're a candidate, that'll be great. And if you're a company looking to hire SDA, that'll be great too. Did I get that correctly, Jamie?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So thanks so much for joining, and we'll talk to you on Friday.
Look forward to it.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs, and this is Sam's Corner. We really enjoyed speaking with Jamie Scarborough, and on Friday Fundamentals, he's going to have some really great insights on how to prepare for an interview. I took away a couple things that we've heard repeatedly on the pod. STA, Sales Talent Agency, the company that Jamie runs, they've developed this thing called DNA Pro. We didn't figure out what Pro stands for because we were having so much fun talking, but we did figure out that DNA stands for Drive, Nature, and Acumen. We talk a lot about qualities that make a great salesperson. I want to focus on drive. And, he has his own way of framing it. And we've talked about the will to sell on the podcast, and commitment, responsibility, outlook, and accountability, and desire. That was the other one. But Jamie frames it as drive. It's not just ambition. So his point is, it's not just about, wanting something big for yourself. It's what are you willing to do to get that? In my world, I call that commitment. In his world, he calls that drive and resiliency. But we recognize that it's just important. What are you willing to do to achieve the goals? And why are you willing to do it? And what proof do you have that you've done that? Also, echoing Danny Hertzberg and a bunch of other people, goal setting. They want to know, hiring managers want to know, what are the goals that you've set, and how can you demonstrate that you've achieved them? And why are those goals interesting to you? Why do they motivate you? Why do they challenge you? So I think that's something else that's interesting. Now, finally, we talked a little bit about comp. Remember to adjust for Canadian dollars, but in the Canadian market, right out of school, we're looking at $42,000 base up to $60,000 Canadian for SDRs, and 20 to 30% bonus on top of that, moving away from including closed business as a payment mechanism, really focused on activities that the SDR can control. Those are going to tend to be set meetings, book meetings, SQO, sales qualified opportunities. We all know that. Some of my best friends are doing point systems that sort of combine a variety of different activities. But that's the comp that you can expect. And then if you're a mid-market rep, he talked about mid-market reps anywhere from 65 to 80,000 Canadian base, maybe as high as 100,000. That sounds about right, because it's about 60,000 US dollars. Another 50% of that's going to come in the form of commission. And then enterprise reps as high as 180, maybe as high as $200,000 against, a $3 to $3.5 million quota. So those are some specific numbers that we can take away in terms of what's happening in the hiring market. This has been Sam's Corner. Before we go, we want to thank our sponsors, Chorus.ai and Outreach. And if you want to get in touch with me, you're always free to do that. If you have feedback on the show, find me on Twitter at Sam F. Jacobs, or on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in and then /Sam F. Jacobs. Of course, we'd love to hear from you. We hope to see you at Unleash, and we hope that you are nominating yourself or your colleagues for the Sales Hacker Top 50, because again, those guests will be featured on the pod. Now, I will see you next time.